Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Julia Ritchie, managing editor with KUER, Ben Winslow, reporter with Fox 13, and Lisa Riley Roche, political reporter with Deseret News. So glad to have you all with us. That was a late night last night, legislative session for you.
So late.
Yes.
I know you were there way past the end of the legislative session. And Ben, is that a shirt that says "Party Like a Journalist"?
It is. You know, welcome to the post-legislative world.
We're just so glad to have you. I know you were following a lot of bills very closely. 534 bills were passed, which is a lot, but not the record.
Right.
Missed it by one.
Right.
Missed it by one. Last year, 535. But this was a big year for bills. 1,359 of them were brought forward. We want to talk about some of the most significant ones in this show today. Lisa, let's start with you. What do you think was most significant or impactful piece of legislation that you followed?
I think it was that our schools now compromise, right? You have this citizens initiative. Looks like it's well on its way to the ballot to raise $700 million for schools, the largest tax increase in Utah history. Republican lawmakers said over and over and over again on the Hill. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they were putting together a compromise that is incredibly complicated, involves asking voters in November if they would like to raise gas taxes by 10 cents a gallon. Also includes a property tax freeze that through some mechanism that I don't fully understand, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to explain to voters, will allow inflation to be captured. So as property values rise, which of course is what we're seeing along the Wasatch Front, your property taxes will go up. But that bill that contained the property tax freeze also had elements of a legislative tax reform package that included cutting income tax, which ironically goes to schools, and also a corporate tax break, something called the single sales factor. It's a way of companies calculate their taxes that'll end up giving them a $28 million tax break. So it's really complicated. It's going to be hard to explain to voters, but it's significant that the legislature got together and came up with a way to get the Our Schools Now petition off the ballot.
Ben, was this a good compromise? Because it was $700 million, right, for the initiative that was going to pass. This is 300-ish.
It
million?
Seems like it is, and if you talk to Our Schools Now backers, they certainly believe that this gives a lot of new money, hundreds of millions of dollars of new money to schools. And this was a ballot initiative that was going fast and furious, but the issue with some of these ones, especially tax hikes, is you put them in front of voters and everybody says, yeah, it's great, I love education, I want to support education. That's awesome. Here's the ballot to raise your taxes. And then voters sometimes go, oh, I'm not sure if I want to raise my own taxes for that. So it was kind of a tricky ballot initiative. So this is a compromise that could really get a lot of money to schools, to teachers, to students, without having this entire issue of maybe it passes and maybe it just goes down in flames.
That is such an interesting point, Julia, right? Because we have a compromise here, but there is still a lot of work to do on these organizers to get voters to vote for this.
Right, and I think that's what they said when they were passing the compromise, is that the Our Schools Now ballot initiative might change, right? It won't be the same sort of tax hike, but they still have to do a large public information campaign to let voters know. If you heard what Lisa just said, that was incredibly complicated, and you're going to have to somehow explain to voters how raising their taxes on gases or on gas will go towards schools when typically it goes towards roads, which it is going towards roads, but now it's going to offset some other money in the budget. It's just going to be hard to get voters to connect the dots, I think.
None of that's going to fit on a bumper sticker. Yeah.
And it's non-binding. Let's remember that.
Right.
It's a non-binding ballot question that the legislature set up a process to ask. And so even if voters say they want to do it, it's still the legislature in 2019 that will have to raise the taxes. And of course, the other side of that is if voters say they don't want to do it, how much obligation are lawmakers going to feel in 2019 to go ahead and pass a pretty hefty gas tax increase.
Last comment on this, Ben?
It's going to be interesting to see how this all works out in 2019.
And this one really did delay it until then, didn't it? So we just have a lot that has to happen. And you mentioned also some money is public ed, higher ed, and some roads. So there's a little bit of that for everyone.
Right. I mean, and I think it should be noted that this was a big break for corporations as well. So I mean, it lowers the corporate income tax rate, and it also does that single sales factor, which is also hard to explain.
Okay.
But I mean, they really did. They killed two birds with one stone with this bill.
That was the way to get the property tax free piece through, was to tie it to these other tax breaks that Republican leadership really wanted. It was just a really interesting packaging of this whole thing, and how they unpack that for voters, as Ben said, is going to be really interesting.
And how they did it in 3 hours on the last night of the session is truly amazing.
They always do that, though. Let's be
Yes.
honest. Yeah.
Save all those things to the end. Okay, thank you. Ben, in your mind, significant and impactful piece of legislation.
Taxes was big. Let's also talk about the Northwest Quadrant and the inland port. This will probably be the biggest economic development project since Brigham Young entered Utah. This is massive, and if you talk to Salt Lake City, it's a land grab. This is, according to Salt Lake City, almost a third of the city that is snapped up into this whole thing, this inland port where you have rail, road, air coming together, import, export, all of this, clearing customs, putting Utah on the map. It's in the same area where Amazon is going, where UPS is building a giant hub. This is a huge development for Utah, and this is a bill that's probably they're still not done fighting over it.
What was the stated purpose of this bill?
It was one city can't do this alone, that this is an economic driver for the entire state, that this is something that the state wants, and that it's good for everybody. But the city views it as just overstepping their authority as a local municipality in their boundaries.
That's right.
This was the trend that we saw, was the state sort of inserting itself in a lot of what people that are opposed to those measures, local control. So there was state over asserting itself over these municipalities, and we're going to continue to see that in some of the bills, like the UTA overhaul, where the state is basically going to get rid of the Utah Transit Authority's board and come up with a governor-appointed board of trustees. Same with the Northwest Quadrant; it'll be a state-stacked board. So a lot of assertion of powers in this session, and I don't think we've seen the end of it.
Well, that's interesting. I want to get to the assertion of power question here in just a moment. But the corollary of that was really the city in this, right? Mayor Biskupski was not thrilled about this piece of legislation. Describe that just a little bit.
Well, she came out with a statement yesterday. I know this was another 11th hour bill. It didn't get much debate. I think 30 minutes on the floor of the House, and it was done. And we're talking, like a third of the size of Salt Lake City's landmass becoming sort of under this state-controlled board. So her concerns, again, is the city losing taxing authority under this deal and land use authority.
The Democrats were especially frustrated with this bill. They felt like they had no input into it. As a minority party, that's not unusual. But they also weren't briefed ahead of time on what the bill would do, and there were a lot of last-minute changes, a lot of last-minute negotiations, and they kind of took the unusual step, at least on the Senate side, of expressing their real frustration with being left out of that process. Because remember, the Democratic stronghold in the state is Salt Lake City.
That is true.
That's the people they represent, and they don't even know what's going on with this thing.
What was this kind of intended to bypass the city? Is that what you were hearing? Is the legislature saying this is too big just to leave to Salt Lake? This is the whole state? Is that the idea?
Well, I believe that is the state's argument there, and it follows the state's involvement in dealing with the homeless situation in Salt Lake, right? The state stepped up. And both of these with a very strong speaker involvement and interest in the issue. Outgoing Speaker Greg Hughes has a lot of interest in Salt Lake City. Perhaps that's because he's going to be running for a statewide office soon and wants to build up a voter base.
Very interesting. So Ben, let's put these together in what Julia brought up as sort of the assertion of control. All right, this is one of those bills. clearly they're taking some power over the city there. But let's get to the UTA, even calling themselves into special session. Talk about a couple of those and why we're seeing this trend.
Well, there was a lot of disagreement with the governor also about who calls the shots on some of these things, and that goes back to even the special election to replace Jason Chaffetz in Congress, and so we saw a lot of those bills as well. And we may still see this play out even more. The governor has hinted that some of these bills may be cruising for a veto, one where lawmakers insert themselves into, the legislature has the authority to insert itself into a lawsuit. The governor is not necessarily a fan of. When I talked to him last night, you do have this proposed constitutional amendment that would allow the legislature to call itself into special session. That's got to go before voters, and that's going to be an interesting sell to voters, is should the legislature do this? The counter argument to that could be, well, this is a slow creep toward a full-time legislature, and voters may not be a fan of that. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that.
Julia, you heard from the speaker about this very issue, right? So what were his thoughts about this idea about whether or not this particular bill does lead them into calling themselves into session all the time?
His defense is that it's the most narrowly crafted. So it's not something that they can call themselves into general session in perpetuity. He said he really wanted to avoid that. He's seen other states where they can't pass a budget, they come to an impasse, and then they keep staying in session. So his defense is that this is not an overreach, right? But then I think this is the example of they've always dabbled with separation of powers in previous sessions, but this year it was separation of powers on steroids, right? They were testing the waters in a lot of different areas, and I think sometimes they failed. Like last night, they wanted to abolish the state school board of education, and that went down in flames. But I think
you had a better quote than that, didn't you? Something with Cheetos.
Oh yeah, flaming hot Cheeto
That's
flames.
how fast that went down.
Exactly.
It was a bill that went so high yet fell so far.
I think you're seeing them test the waters and see how far they can assert those state rights. So,
well, let's hit the separation of powers, because one of the bills I thought was interesting was this Senate Bill 171, allowing the legislature to intervene into lawsuits on their own, with $700,000 set aside for those lawsuits, maybe instead of the Attorney General's office. Lisa, what's going on with that particular thing?
I did not follow that particularly closely, but it seems like it's just part of this trend of trying to find ways that they can insert themselves into what the executive branch has traditionally done. We talked about UTA briefly. Yeah. That is going to be a really interesting change for a lot of people. UTA, as we know it, is pretty much gone, and it may even have a new name, although the governor told me last night that he wants to put the pause button on a name change.
So Transit District of Utah, that's maybe not the name that governor wants?
And the governor's point in the interview that my colleague Dennis Romboy and I had with him last night was there's no reason to change the name. People like the transit authority. They like the service they get. They like the people they see driving the buses and running the trains. And as long as they're getting good service, they're going to be happy. The problems and the negativity surrounding UTA isn't the name, isn't that image of the service. It's all of the problems that led up to the ongoing federal investigation that UTA is heavily involved in. So why change the name? Why rebrand it that way? He said, bring in some professionals. Let's take a look at what we really need to do. But he does very much. And he said, by the way, that the bill passed by the legislature, another huge, complicated omnibus bill dealing with transportation issues, would allow it doesn't mandate the name change. It would allow them to reconsider that. But that bill does so many other things, as Julia said. It changes the oversight of UTA from a 16-member board of trustees to 3 full-time. They're calling them trustees, but basically they're similar to what we see in a county commission, for example. Right. They've limited their salaries. They've gotten rid of the UTA General Counsel, and they're going to have the Utah Attorney General's office handle legal matters for the entity. It's a sea change.
It really is. Ben, you sat down with the governor and talked through some of these things, I know. What are his thoughts about the assertion of power we're seeing from the legislature?
Well, he's going to take a close look at it. He was kind of playing it a little close to the vest, but he did have some concerns about some of these things that, again, potential for a full-time legislature, inserting itself into lawsuits. He pointed out he's the one who gets sued It's his name on all these lawsuits. It's so-and-so v. Gary Herbert. And, he did hint that that particular one may be cruising for a veto here, that may be the one that he ends up doing. We're going to see. He's got 30 days. Legislature's work is done. His work is just beginning.
We're going to see more vetoes this year than we did in the previous session. I think he issued one, right, in 2017, or maybe a line item. I don't know. He's very.
There's not very many.
He's very reticent with his veto pen. But this year, I don't know. I think he suggested to everyone yesterday that there were a lot of concerns that he had with the legislation that was passed. So.
And yet, at the same time, he said it was the best session ever.
Yeah,
That's what we always say. Right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, he did seem particularly upbeat. It seems like in past sessions there was usually an issue between the governor and the legislature at some point during the session that either got resolved behind the scenes or was headed for a veto. And he has obviously indicated that possibility with the bill that allows the legislature to insert itself in legal matters. But he didn't really seem to feel that bad about anything else except the UTA name change, and he said that wasn't a veto issue. That was simply an issue that the Transportation Task Force of the legislature needs to deal with.
They'll just put up a Twitter poll and give us some options, and then popular vote.
He offered some in our interview. You can call it UTA, you can call it PTA, you can call it.
What about the Ben Winslow bus that goes up to the Capitol?
I'd vote for that.
Yeah.
Okay, Julie, we've hit on some really great bills so far. In your mind, another maybe something we haven't got to so far, a significant, impactful piece of legislation?
I think it's worth mentioning that they really took the issue of youth suicide.
Yes.
They really tackled that this year. They formed a commission or task force or whatever you want to call it, and looked at ways that they could actually tackle this issue. They passed a suite of bills, one that would staff suicide crisis lines 24/7. They named that Hannah's Bill after a Huntsville teen who committed suicide in 2014. And they also did a lot of Medicaid waivers to help with mental illness issues, which is something that I think they've gotten some flack for in the past for not doing enough. So I thought that was kind of interesting that we didn't get a lot of attention because it passed early in the session, and a lot of these late in the hour things were much more contentious. But that was something that everyone across the board agreed on.
And yet that gun bill toward the end that Representative Handy carried, it was portrayed as more of a school safety bill, but it also would have helped with the suicide issue, right? By allowing people to go to court and get guns taken away from someone who is a danger to themselves or others.
Yeah, willing to tackle mental illness issues in a very narrow sense, right?
To a point.
To a point.
Yeah. And the whole school safety issue. There was, after the Parkland shooting in Florida, there seemed to be real interest, at least for a moment, in addressing some of those issues, not just gun control. It's a Republican-dominated legislature. That's a difficult issue. But we were told everything was on the table until it wasn't.
Yeah. Was there anything in the end that you saw besides one of these like school safety?
I think the only school safety bill that actually passed was the one allowing schools to lock their doors.
Right.
Senator Weiler's bill.
And that was really separated from the whole momentum for gun control and school safety that came after Parkland. Although the House did put together some kind of a group that's going to meet privately to talk about issues and not make any public comment until their work is done, which is an interesting way to deal with something that concerns pretty much everyone in the state.
Yep. So Julia hit on one interesting issue. It was so contentious in the past. This is Medicaid expansion.
Right.
All right, there's a time when you didn't touch any of this, but it happened this time. Right? So Medicaid expansion bill finally happened. Who was following that issue closely, Ben?
A little bit.
On Medicaid expansion, why was there an appetite for it this time?
You should talk about it in terms of like why they are tackling issues that will be on the ballot in November.
It's because there is a ballot initiative. You look at what's going on. You have 6 issues, well now 5 potentially, depending on how that Our Schools Now thing shakes out. You've got 6 potential ballot initiatives. You saw some bills dealing with that, and lawmakers were saying, no, we're not being dictated by these things, but their actions were speaking louder than their words. And there were a lot of bills, and some of these Medicaid bills were also dealing with issues that they were facing in other ways. Things were interconnected. You had the youth suicide crisis that's going on. You have the opioid epidemic that's going on. You just have affordable housing issues. You have all these other homelessness issues, and they are interconnected. And some of these things, you would see these bills applying for Medicaid waivers because the federal government, at least now with this administration, seems a little more willing to grant these things. So you saw the one that would have expanding up to 100% of the poverty level with a work requirement. Right. Then you had ones that would allow for substance abuse treatment or mental health treatment or all these things, trying to fill in this gap, but while at the same time avoiding the previous fights over who pays for it. Mm-hmm.
That was one of the most emotional debates, I think, of the whole session in the Senate, was over the Medicaid expansion, because the state has had that opportunity for years to accept the federal program that was available. But it was under a Democratic administration. The legislature made it very, very clear over and over and over again they had no interest in accepting that money. Even the Republican governor of the state, Gary Herbert, came up with a way to take most of that money, and that wasn't accepted by the legislature. But now, under a new administration, a Republican administration, suddenly Medicaid expansion is something we can talk about.
You think it's because of the new administration? I was wondering if it's also because of all these changes in our legislature, particularly people who are not coming back.
Well, I think it's a mix of the initiative pressure, clearly, but I think it is also a lot easier for these Republicans to say, okay, we can do this because it's a Republican administration, and somehow a Republican administration is going to look at the same rules that govern waivers under a Democratic administration and do something different, especially this Republican administration that's not even fully staffed in a lot of these areas to do the kinds of things they want done.
You touched on this issue about how some of this legislation impacts those initiatives. Ben, there were 3 bills on marijuana, and we have a medicinal marijuana initiative coming forward.
We
you go
certainly
right
do.
to party like a journalist.
Yes, I thought it was appropriate.
Yes, you have the one that allows, it's the right to try that passed, that allows terminally ill patients in limited circumstances to try medical cannabis. Then you have the one that allows the state to grow the weed for them, which is very novel and very interesting. You have a bill that legalized CBD oil that passed, and then there's a cleanup bill on industrial hemp for research purposes for the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. All of these are very interesting. Medical marijuana advocates say this is not nearly enough, and it will not stop them, and they are moving forward nonstop with this, and they have right now more than 150,000 signatures, which is more than enough to qualify for the ballot in November if those signatures can be verified to meet the threshold. But it appears that's going to be on the ballot, and voters are going to have to decide medical marijuana in November.
I mean, a couple years ago, the fact that Utah legalized, even in a narrow sense, medical marijuana, that would have been huge news, and it barely made a blip this year just because there was so much else going on, and because the attitudes have shifted around medical marijuana, especially with all the states around us having legalized it in some form or another. But yeah, it's just interesting. House Minority Leader Brian King told me this was the most progressive legislature he's seen. I mean, expanding the social safety net, legalizing medical marijuana, more funding, hiking taxes for education. These are things that we never would have seen in years past, but because of these ballot initiatives, he thinks he was very pleased as well. And you don't always hear the Democrats that pleased at the end of a legislative session.
What do you think, Lisa? Is that true?
Well, I think the Democrats always end up saying that they're, just like the governor, that they're pleased with how things went because they ended up with a little something at the end. But Democrats didn't have a much of a voice this session. They're small in numbers. As I said, in the not medical marijuana, the Medicaid expansion. Debate, a lot of that emotion came from the Democrats. There were tearful people on the Senate floor saying so many people are still being left out of Medicaid expansion. There was a lot of frustration among the Democrats, too, that while there was some effort, it didn't go as far as it could go. And same with medical marijuana, right? I mean, this only allows terminally ill people with less than 6 months to live to be treated.
Right.
And
It's
so,
a very limited bill.
as one Democrat said in the debate, if this helps somebody and they live longer, why wouldn't we be pleased with that and want to continue to help them? But
one of the interesting things, just at the close of this very instructive dialogue here, there was a provision about the lobbyists on the Hill. Seemed that there was some concern about the number of people that were trying to impact the legislation. Representative Val Peterson actually sponsored a piece of legislation saying no one from a governmental entity could be there on the Hill. Ben, why were they trying to do that? The bill died, and we'll talk about why. Why was there such concern about the number of people up there lobbying this year?
Well, from their perspective, they were feeling overwhelmed. Whether or not you believe that, that's a matter of opinion, I guess. But they were certainly feeling like everybody is coming up and hitting them up, and it's that they really should be going through designated channels. Interesting to note, the governor issued an executive order effectively doing the same thing and also including a gift ban.
But isn't this just part of the pushback from the legislature to the executive branch? We want more control. We want to show that we're in charge, and we can tell you can't even send your people up here to tell us about the issues that we're legislating on. I mean,
is that right, Julia?
They did cut lobbyists one break, and they will not have to take sexual harassment training next year.
But we do.
But we do.
yes.
Yes, I couldn't help but notice, but members of the media do have to take the sexual harassment training.
Even though our companies already require, I think, virtually all of us to have that training.
Yeah.
And a lot of lobbyists are independent contractors who, I don't know if you work for yourself, if you give yourself that training, but we do.
Yes, we do. Thank you very much. Very instructive, great legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight's show. The conversation continues online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.